Well, I add my own good morning, and I'm especially glad this morning that you are here, that some of you are watching this morning and engaged in that way, because this morning I believe that God has the ultimate proposal for our lives, the deepest proposal that will ever be extended to us, really the question of a lifetime. And it's this: do you love me? That is the question that God ultimately wants to invite us to engage this morning. And I know that for some of us to hear such a question, we might feel like I'm just coming to explore who God is. And so you may not feel ready to respond to that, but I believe it's really vital that you hear that proposal. And for some, maybe it's the time of hearing that and saying, I am ready to say yes. I am digging through my heart and what it is that I give myself to. And for others, perhaps it's a time of knowing that I have had that love, but it's like a time in which a couple might say we need to reaffirm our vows. And maybe today is a day of reconfirming that love in your own heart. And so with that loftiness, I want to invite you to again pause with me, if you would, and let's just take a moment to pray and kind of just open our hearts to what God has. Would you do that with me? God, we know questions that are large and they run deep and so personal to us. We dare to pause and open our hearts to your invitation to us. Our minds go many ways, and there are many things that feel very unsettled in us. But we pray that your Spirit would speak that which is utterly true and defining of who we are and what we're meant to know. So we open our minds and our hearts to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me say, by way of backdrop to, we are concluding really a series that has been focused on how do we form our own love for God, God being our first love. If he is the source and we exist in him, then really that is the core of who we are, our first love. And to this, Jesus called us to make this our first love, to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so we come to that and we look at how Jesus was calling lives to that. And I think it's important for us to realize that the Bible is not really a book of religious rules, that particularly as we come into the New Testament, the Bible is an invitation to see how God is inviting humanity into relationship. And particularly how God is inviting each of us, every life, to know him and to be reconciled to him through Jesus and what he's coming to bring to bear. And this is what we find. The Bible is really telling the story of how we have lost our own story, if you will, and how the message is this, that we have so lost our relationship with the very author of life that we really don't know what story we're in. And we each may have some semblance of that story. We each may feel like we have a sense that there's something transcendent in life, and we're trying to kind of write our own story, but that story never really makes total sense. We never find something coherent. And it is to this that God begins to make known, this is the story of how you were meant to be and how I am redeeming that, and ultimately coming in the one who the prophets had spoken long before would come and make God known and reconcile us and restore us. And that is what Christ does. And as Christ comes in, he begins to engage lives by rerouting them and reclaiming them into that true story. That otherwise we are like those who we don't know the author, we don't make sense of it. And so as Jesus does that, every life we see is that which he's reclaiming. And this is particularly true of the life of all of his disciples, those core 12. And we might think he had an instant moment where they all understood it, but actually it's far from that. Those 3 years that he spent with them were 3 years of them trying to figure out who he really was. And their commitment was not a simple commitment. We might think they just said, "Oh, I know who you are, I got it." No, they're confounded the whole time with what he's making known. That is especially true of one disciple, the very first one he called, the one who would become something of the leader of the disciples, the life of Peter. And I invite us to engage that life and to hear that in the invitation he makes to that life, that he is making an invitation to each of us. So for those less familiar with Peter, as I said, he is the first one who's called. And we hear about this in the Gospel of John in the very first chapter, where it says this: Andrew, who was Peter's brother, Andrew went to find his brother Simon and told him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. Then Andrew brought Simon to meet Jesus. Looking intently at Simon, Jesus said, "Your name is Simon, son of John, but you will be called Cephas," which means Peter. And as it's noted there, the name Cephas from the Aramaic and Peter from the Greek both mean the rock. So what is happening here is a reflection of what happens to all. He looks at Simon, as he's known, and he calls him by the name that he has always gone by and been known by, and he looks intently at him and says his name, Simon, son of John. In other words, he's saying, "I see you. I know you. I recognize how you have understood yourself. I've been watching you." And he had. He'd been there interacting with these lives before he now calls these 12 who he will now journey with for these 3 years. And he says to him, "I know who you are," but then he says, "But I'm giving you a new name." Or in essence, I am going to tell you what you can become. And you will become like a rock. You will become one who will become such a solid foundation that others will be able to find that strength upon your knowledge of me. Now, for those who knew something of Peter, he was, and we can see, a very strong character. He was clearly kind of the leader of this group of fishermen. He was one who had boldness and courage as they followed Jesus. He's the one who will leap out of the boat first. When Jesus says, "Who do you think I am?" he's the one who will answer first. He becomes one of the core 3 that Jesus takes with him into some of the most intimate moments of his life. But Peter was incredibly impulsive, and he is one that would always be kind of serving his own story, his own sense of trying to be the hero of the story, not always serving others. And so his friends would have looked upon him and thought, "Rock, I don't know if I see that in him. That is not really his nature. He can't be relied upon in that way. Bold, yes, but impulsive. He is one who always has to be the hero of the story, and that is kind of his weakness." And so it is that Jesus is saying, "You are this, but you will become transformed. You are going to become something different. You are going to become all that you are meant to be." That is what he speaks over his life. He is giving him a different role, the potential to become who he was truly meant to be. And that is what we see as he continues. And Peter would become one, though, who had a hard time because of his own sense of strength in the very idea that Jesus was going to suffer and die. For him, he wanted to be with a winner. He was that kind of person. And so Jesus entering into Jerusalem, wonderful. But when Jesus starts to speak of how he must suffer and die, this is where Peter rebukes him. And you have this tragic conflict in which he still doesn't grasp who Jesus is. And then Jesus speaks about how everyone will abandon him. And this is where Peter can't handle that. He rises up and he says, declares, even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you. And there we see that Peter had this pride that he needed to be the hero of the story. He needed to be special. And you might think at this point that Jesus would love to hear those words of loyalty to him, but Jesus understood that in those words of loyalty, they were mixed with his own pride, that he would never be able to accept the bigger picture of the bigger story of what's happening because it was all about him and his own heroics. And so Jesus had to speak into him and say, you don't understand. On this very night, you will deny me 3 times. Jesus is arrested, and it becomes true. After he's arrested, and everybody is huddled around, and there in the courtyard in the city, someone comes up to Peter as he's trying to warm himself by the fire and says, aren't you one of his followers? And you may recall that Peter says, no, I'm not. You've mistaken me. Another comes to him and another, and finally says, I never even knew him. The very one who had just proclaimed how he was better than anyone, that he was more special, that he was so strong, that he was the hero. In that very moment, Peter is now completely lost. He's lost in his own story. He has no story. He is no longer the hero. And he's lost from Jesus, who was calling him in. And it's at this that we find that Jesus hasn't been finished with Peter and that he will come back to him. But Peter had to wonder, is this done? What about our relationship? Like, is it over for me? And so it is that as they go forward, you find that Peter is deeply struggling with these things. And that when Jesus is killed and crucified, Peter's in hiding. And after Jesus is arisen, Peter discovers this to be true, that he is risen. He even encounters him. But he still wonders about this. But what about our relationship? I denied him. We have not reconciled. Does he want anything to do with me? How does he feel towards me? These are the questions that turn over for all of the disciples. And so at one point, Peter says to them, he's feeling so lost, like he doesn't know how to go forward. And he says, let's just go fishing. Now, you've got to remember that when Peter was first called by Jesus, he dropped his nets and followed him. He left fishing, and most people would say he left it behind and never looked back. But here he is trying to go back. But there's really nothing there. It's going to prove empty. How many of us have said, you know what, I may just want to go back into that other life, go back to a life apart from what God has said about me, and we find that we really can't go back. It's kind of an emptiness that's there. Well, I think that's the place that Peter and the other disciples find themselves. They're kind of lost, wondering if God is still one who would invite them into that kind of special relationship of love that they had had with him. And so they go fishing, and they go out, and it says that they were out all night, and they caught nothing. They caught nothing. But then, as John tells us at the very end of his gospel, in the 21st chapter, it says how, but then a voice from the shoreline, they hear him. They can't make out who it is. And he says, how's it going? You caught anything? And they're like, no, don't bring that up. Throw your nets on the other side. And they do. And there is such a rush of fish, and they're astounded. Why? Because what was happening in that moment was exactly what happened when they first encountered Jesus, and he invited them to follow them. It was the way in which he first engaged them, and they had been out all night long, and Jesus said, go out and throw your net out into that deep area. And they said to him, Peter said to him, are you kidding? We fished all night. There's nothing there. But if you say so because of who you are and who we think you are in terms of coming from God, well, we'll do it. And they do it, and they have this insane catch of fish. And Peter is so humble and says, you are God, and recognizes that. And Jesus says, I'll make you fisher of men. and Peter drops his net and goes. Well, that moment is being reenacted right now. Jesus is on the shoreline, and he tells them once again to throw their net, and once again they have that catch. And in this moment of reenacting, what we realize is it's like a husband who comes to the wife and says, you know what, I want to take you back to the place that we were first wed. I want to take you back to the place that we first met each other. I want to take you back there so that you will and I will remember what this is all about. Remember the love that we had. Jesus is reenacting that for him. And it's absolutely a stunning moment for them. But then they make their way to the shore, and the question remains, in Peter's mind, what will Jesus say? How will Jesus engage me? And that's where we come as we come now to verse 15. When they make their way to shore, and it says, starting at verse 15, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? There he is, the one who's just denied him. He's just feeling all the shame of the fact that he is not all that he had hoped to be, that all his pride and his presumptions had failed. And in that moment he says, yes, Lord. He says, you know that I do love you. Jesus said, then feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Now Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved, which was a euphemism that John used to speak of himself, John, the writer of this very gospel. So he is writing and speaking of what he recalls firsthand, that how Peter looked at him in this moment. And he said, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at this Last Supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? Speaking of himself. When Peter saw this, he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? And then he presents those words by which he first engaged Peter. You must follow me. And with those words, he's making the same proposal to Peter that he had made at the beginning, to follow him. He's offering that same calling, that same life. It is that same call. And he presents these questions to him, and they're all centered on this, which is really, do you love me? That is the primary central invitation to him. Now, there are all kinds of questions that Peter might have asked, what you and I might imagine, like, what were you thinking, Peter? Why did you deny me, Peter? Like, aren't you ashamed, Peter? All of those things that Jesus could have asked. That's probably the things that Peter imagined he would be asking. They're the kinds of things that we think God would ask of us. Why have you done this? Why have you done that? Why are you struggling with this? Why are you finding your heart and your behavior so drawn into these? We might think that's the biggest question that God has for us, but it's not. It is this: do you love me? Those are the words that he put to Peter. Because God knows that everything was meant to be driven by our love for God. That is what was meant to be shaping things. What you love determines how you will live. What you love determines how you will live. And this is why Jesus said, if you want to align your life then start with this. First and foremost, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. This is our first love because God is our first relationship. He is the core of our existence. And this is the essence of how God shapes us. It is by what is in our hearts, not merely by our outward behavior, but what is inside of us. That is what is there to change us, to transform us. We must be loved in order to love. And it is this relationship of love which has the power, the ultimate power, to truly transform us. You will never become a better person by merely guilt, by merely duty. You never will. It's a good foundation, but all it does, guilt and duty, is remind us of what is missing. Remind us if there's something empty and wrong. What is it that sets us right? It is love. It is the power to be loved and out of that love to love. This is why it is our first love. But it's also here that we see that Jesus is emphasizing what? With all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your strength, all because Jesus understood one thing. That first love is a love that by its nature is first. It cannot be divided. We cannot merely love God in some form or fashion by which he is merely one of competing loves. That there is a sense of priority to it, a sense that it is the most defining of loves. And I particularly cannot love God as God in a partial way. Why? Because the whole point is that it is a love for God who is preeminent. I'm not loving him as God if I love him as just some kind of equal among the many loves of life. And so he's saying your whole life is meant to be known that you are loved by your very creator, your very source of life. And out of that, your love will be first and foremost a love for God. And this is becoming so important for what Jesus is trying to get at with Peter, that there needs to be an all-in, undivided. There are some things in life that you just can't kind of do halfway. It's just like that by their very nature. It's fundamental. You can't kind of jump out of a plane. Did you know that? Like you can't. And you can't like kind of move to another country. Like you either do it or you don't. There's no kind of do it. You can't kind of get married. You can't half get married. And you can't half love God. The very nature of loving God is that it is a love that is preeminent. And that is so pointed for us, I think, on this of all weeks where we gather as it's been referred to as Palm Sunday, traditionally known as Palm Sunday, the week prior to the events of Good Friday and Easter, to the death and resurrection, because it is a reminder that it was on that Sunday of that Holy Week in which Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey. And as he comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, he is coming as king. And he knows what the people see, that it's a victorious king who rides the donkey. The warrior king who's going to battle might ride a horse. But when they're victorious, actually the great dignity is that they come as the one who has prevailed and brought peace. And so Jesus is entering on a donkey and the people come out. The masses have come for Passover and they come out, the masses, and they begin to take palm branches, something that was a part of tradition to welcome a king. And they would wave them and then lay them on the roads for him to come across. And this is what they do. And they shout cheers of Hosanna, which means welcome, save us. But here's the profound thing about that Palm Sunday that many of you are familiar with, that much of that crowd would turn on Jesus, and the very ones who had welcomed him would soon withdraw from him by the end of the week. Jesus knew this. It's shocking to us that they would turn and say, crucify him who had once welcomed him in, because they only wanted him to be, to them, the one who would, kind of restore their national identity. Come, get rid of Roman oppression, that's the issue. But they did not understand that, no, what was at hand is that he would have to come and be a sacrifice for their own sin, for all of humanity, to set right and reconcile humanity with God. And so when they see him arrested, they're like, whoa. When they see that the Roman emperor is standing up there with a beaten Jesus and a bloody Jesus, they want nothing of it. He is not the one who is giving us our national identity and pride again. And so they turn on him, many of them. And we can be shocked by it, but Jesus was not shocked. He had always seen what was in the hearts of people, that people can be divided, that people want him to be one thing, but when they realize that he will suffer and become a sacrifice, that is hard for them to deal with. That is hard for them to grasp. It is a love that is so penetrating and speaks so deeply. And so Jesus knew how the human heart would be and that we can find ourselves divided, and he is speaking into that. As Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. That we cannot be divided in heart. If we are after the prominence and the things of this world, if that's where we think we're going to find our story, is somehow how it gets played out and we get to be the hero, or that we somehow can find our pride in this life, we're going to find ourselves in conflict. Because what God is doing and the powers of what this world has claimed upon us are two different things. And that distinction will come into conflict at some point. And so he is calling out the problem of trying to serve both of those. And many of us have known that when you try to serve the best of both worlds, and you think somehow, well, I can really just seek everything of what this world has to offer, but I'll kind of love God enough to somehow, have a relationship in the religious compartment of my life. It never ends up playing out that way. We end up with no story at all. We end up where we're lost between two worlds, not gaining the best of two worlds. We find ourselves empty, and many of us have known that. That when we kind of try to have a semi-love for God, or we kind of are like the one who says, well, I'll get, married, but I'll keep my girlfriend's old phone number, I'll kind of hedge my bets and keep something on the side. You end up failing in every way. You end up divided. Jesus understood this so much, and he understood that even Peter faced that. And so he's saying to him, do you truly love me? And I want to conclude quickly with just taking this moment apart. And the first thing that we need to hear that he's saying is this: do you truly love me? Do you embrace the power of sacrificial love that serves others? With every affirmation, when Jesus says, do you love me? Notice what he says afterwards. Then what? Then go and serve others sacrificially. Go and feed my lambs. Go and take care of my sheep. Why does he bring that to bear in these questions of love? Because that is what Peter was having a hard time with. That's where Peter was divided. Peter liked the all-powerful one. Peter was way more trusting in the power to kill than the power to die. Peter trusted the power to kill. When Jesus was arrested, who was it that pulled out a dagger and went at it was Peter. Peter said, we can win this thing. He trusted in human force more than the power of God to come and die to serve others. This is what he had wrestled with. When Jesus went to wash his feet as an act of service and tell him, hey, you all need to go learn how to do the same. Be the one who's willing to serve. Who was the one that was uncomfortable with it? Peter. Peter said, you shall not wash my feet. See, Peter had a hard time with this. This is where he was divided. And so Jesus is bringing home, do you get it now, Peter? Do you understand that I had to die? And the power, the greater power that comes with the power of divine love that is sacrificial and willing to die and willing to ultimately serve others. And so he's calling them to that, to come out of that divided place. That's what he's inviting us to do, to understand that This is what's needed. Judgment will come, but that is not what's all powerful. What's really powerful is mercy and grace. And now Peter finds himself facing that. He stood before the face of grace and he understood the power of grace. He understood the power of sacrificial love. He understood the power of serving. And this, he says, I do love you. And he is able to reaffirm this. And we need to ask ourselves, will we love God as we hear that he is calling us to give up our lives in order to be servants of what God's doing? And when we do, it will mean that we come into the story of God, a story that we don't completely get to write ourselves, that we're not in control of everything. And this is why Jesus needs to add that to what's taking place. So listen to what and remind what Jesus goes on to say. He says, I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this, it says, to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Now, this is a statement, this idea that, we're not the ones in control of the story, and that eventually we're going to have to now move into a way of life in which we don't control the end of our stories, we don't write it. That this is being said by Jesus, who had just been taken and beaten and mocked and crucified. Not because that is what he wanted, but because he knew that the will of the Father was to bring a sacrifice that would reconcile humanity, that he was bearing that upon himself. And so to listen to Jesus say these words was to listen to one who had just suffered so greatly, one who knew that he had to trust himself to the Father's will and to the sovereignty of what heaven was doing on earth, despite his desire for control. And Peter loved control. Peter was the one who always thought the answer was to get control of things. And there are many things we control, but there's an illusion of control. There's a point in which we don't have control. We're not the ones who are sovereign over life. And so Jesus is bringing this to bear. And he's saying it pointedly to Peter because of the kind of death that he would face. And Eusebius tells us, the historian of the first century, how Peter would be crucified himself by Nero in 68 AD. So it is true that, yes, Peter would ultimately face such a death, such a time where he would not have control of all things. And he's not saying to us that each of us must, face the death of a martyr, but each of us might ask the question, am I able to respond to a love by which it means I don't control everything? And if we're honest, this can be one of the hardest parts, because some of us have faced deep disappointments where we thought, God didn't do what I wanted, and I have a hard time with that. Tragic things have happened that God allowed to happen, not because he wanted them, but because he has not yet brought judgment and restored all of his will on earth yet. And so I've had to suffer deeply. And so in that disappointment, we withdraw, and we find ourselves on the sidelines, like Peter, saying, this is not the way I wanted it. You're not doing what I wanted. And so Jesus is saying, Peter, do you understand that you will have to enter into that story in which you don't know the end? When I've done weddings, one of the points I'll often make is that marriage is more like an adventure than a job. There's that Marine Corps ad that used to say, it's not a job, it's an adventure. What's the point they were making? Well, in a job, all the expectations are defined, but in an adventure, you never really know. You're committing to something that will unfold as it goes. That's the way of marriage, but it's also the way of life. And most of us will find that life will have taken some turns we never saw coming. Turns around corners that we find ourselves going, I didn't expect this to happen. And when we get there, we can find ourselves saying, it doesn't all make sense now. I don't get it. This isn't what I thought I would find myself facing. And we can feel lost. And What Jesus is speaking into is that lostness. He says, don't you realize, and you need to trust, I will be with you wherever life takes you. And so you need to know that in the space and place that you may say, I've been deeply disappointed, disillusioned, I find myself life bringing suffering that I never wanted, that Jesus wants you to hear, but I am with you in that. Look what I went through. The Father was with me, and I am with you. And so when we say yes to love, we're saying yes to a love that involves that. Jesus wanted to make that clear to Peter, and he wants to make that clear to us as well. For Jesus said, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. If you're willing to give up your own writing of your own story, your own demands on your life, your own sense of this is what I must do, this is what defines me, if you're willing to give that up and say, I am God's and I am a servant of that, then you will actually find who you are. That's what Peter did, and that's what Peter found. And to join this, we find that the second question then is this: do you accept that such devotion involves letting go of your own ultimate sovereign control? And now there's one more aspect that we find in this question that is proposed to Peter and to us. And then we pick up in verse 20, it says, Peter now turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. And when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. When Peter looks over at John, he's saying, oh, well, look, I hear this call upon me and this invitation and the question, do you love me? But I noted, wait a minute, now I'm thinking about him. What about him? Now, they were close friends in ways, and they'd been fishing together all their lives. So, of course, he's curious, what about him? Maybe he thinks that maybe he's got something special for him, and maybe he's feeling the competition. Like, I'm trying to feel special, and I need to know, but what about him? Is he going to have a better deal, a better life? We don't really know, but what we do know is this: that Jesus makes it very clear, and we need to hear it too. Thirdly, this: do you accept that such a choice must be your own? A commitment that is rooted in your own unique responsibility, that is, your ability to respond, and your own unique relationship. When one commits their life, they're committing whose life? Their life. When you commit your life, you're committing your life. You're embracing that this life is yours and this choice is yours. And he's speaking into that part of us who, when we hear the question, do you love me? We might ponder, well, let me think about my family and my friends. And he's saying, but no, I'm asking you. I'm asking you, Peter. I'm asking you, David. I'm asking you, whatever your name may be. You can fill it in. I'm asking you, do you love me? The answer to that question cannot be answered on the basis of any other person. Not your husband, not your wife, not your family, not your friends. It's a question that must come directly to him. And though he found himself lost, in this moment, he had been found by Jesus. That is what we hear and must hear. Peter is now facing. Jesus sees him, and Peter has been thinking this whole time, I don't know where to go. I can't go back. I'm lost. And Jesus is saying, no, the way forward is always forward. It's not time for you to go back. Some of us wonder, should we just kind of go back to somehow try to find life again in something else? And Jesus, by showing up and asking this question, is saying, no. The proposal remains. The question at hand for you in your life, the question of a lifetime is this: do you love me? And it is in that question that Jesus is saying the way forward is forward. And there, Peter realizes that he once again has been found by God. Found this time, though, on the other side of all of his vanity of pride and presumption about who he was. And the question comes to him, do you love me as one who knows that you're not the hero of the story? But I still love you. You were never meant to be the hero of the story. You were never meant to have to try to be more than you are, which is pretty much how we all try to do life. We're all trying to be more than we are. And he says, Peter, now that you know that you're not, now you can really emerge. And so we asked him that question, do you love me? And in this moment, not only does Peter respond, but in this moment, Jesus places that question before all of us. You see, Jesus has come to the shorelines of our own lives. He's standing on the shore of your life and my life. And he's inviting us to come into his presence like he did them, to come face to face with the face of grace, and to hear his words, do you love me? That's a deeply personal question. But I want to conclude by giving us a moment with that question. Perhaps you're one who's not ready, like you're just meeting, and it would be presumptive of you to maybe say, I don't know if I understand all things, but you need to grasp that is the question and to hear it deeply. It is the defining question of our lives. And maybe for some of us, it's a time to say yes or reaffirm that yes. So I want to invite you to join me. Would you join me as we pray? God, we come as those who we know that we can be divided in heart. And I think for a lot of us here, we feel that. We're drawn towards a love for you, but when we're asked the question, do we love you? We know that it calls deeply to us, and we welcome you to speak this afresh into our own hearts. I pray that your Spirit would now allow each of us to hear the question, what is really an invitation. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? For some of us, and if this be you, I welcome you to affirm in your own heart that there is a yes. That this is the defining love of all of life, the one that has come to bear your own sin, your own separation, your own shame, who came and bore that all, that you might be reconciled to God. Claimed again by the Father of your life. Jesus, we receive that love. We receive your love and your forgiveness. And we say yes to your invitation of love. For some of us, it's a reaffirmation that yes, we come and realize that we have perhaps been disappointed in ourselves and disillusioned with life, and we've had the wrong expectations and found ourselves on trying to somehow live between loves. May you be our first love. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Before we close and respond in worship, one more part of the invitation that I want to make to us, and it's this, that Peter was profoundly transformed. The whole story is one that denied Jesus 3 times and lived with the fact that he was ashamed of him on that night. But we read how immediately they go and they wait for Christ. He's ascended. He says, wait for the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God falls. And here's what's so profound. When they come out of the city of Jerusalem, the very same city, it says that all the people were staring at them. What is happening to this group? And it says, Peter raised his voice and spoke out and declared what God was doing and who Jesus was. The one who denied now declared. In other words, he went from one who was feeling ashamed of the sacrifice of Christ to one who was now shameless about it. He was able to find that security to now declare this is true. And so the invitation I want to invite us into this week with is this. Are we prepared to have a shameless love? And that might mean for some of us to be able to say, yes, this is what I believe. And my invitation would be that even this week in your heart, you'd say, yes, I want to go into this week and share with somebody and just openly in a natural way, like what I actually believe and who I understand this Jesus to be, especially of all weeks when we come to his death and his resurrection. It's a great chance to just open up conversation. Invite somebody to consider. Invite them to join you next week. But also, it's a time in which we understand why Jesus said, believe, yes, but also be baptized. In other words, make a public declaration of this. Because he understood the power of that shamelessness that says, you know what? I'm willing to declare that this is the love that I have received. I'm willing to say I understand that death and that new life by going under the water and rising to that new life, and I'm willing to make that known. Some of you maybe have not been baptized, and you realize, yeah, that I get it. There's a shamelessness that I need to come to like Peter. And I want to invite you to come and explore that as well. Join us right after service. Just come and find out more. Let's worship. Would you stand?